Dust. Dust everywhere. The whining, monotonous voice rose shrill. It's impossible to keep things clean in this house, Mr. Corfield. The maids and I spend all our time in trying, and we never succeed. Ordinary London dirt is bad enough, but when it comes to antiques as well, that's the penalty of marrying a scientist, Mrs. Marinder. The house is a regular museum. I hate them. The mummies, the curiosities, all of them. The whine took a sharper note. The way they harbor dust. It's not natural. A human house isn't their right place. Dr. Paul Marinder laughed softly. My wife, as you see, has a violent spite against my unfortunate mummies, Corfield, he said, in his pleasant, gentle voice. And, after all, the poor souls can't help the fact that they found the way to dusty death, as Shakespeare calls it so many centuries ago. But you could help bringing them here and keeping them here, Mrs. Marinder snapped. They ought to be decently buried, I say. Well, perhaps they shall be some day, my dear. Dr. Marinder spoke pacifically. He was a slim, upright man under 40, with fair hair and a pink complexion. Something, too, that was wistful and appealing in his blue eyes. The contrast to his wife was amazing. Mrs. Marinder was at least 20 years his senior, tall, gaunt, with a jaundiced skin and iron-gray hair. Her brown eyes were lusterless, and upon her upper lip was a large and disfiguring fleshy wart. Her dress was of the color of coffee grounds, outlined in passementerie. Altogether, she was a woman, one would say, born to be a companion, but not to a man. To Stephen Corfield, freshly home from South Africa, and meeting his friend's wife for the first time, the question why Marinder should have married her was quite unanswerable, until the solution was given by Mrs. Marinder herself. I really think I might have some say in the matter, considering that all the horrid things are bought with my money. Dr. Marinder's color deepened to crimson, but he spoke gently. And you'd far rather spend it on vacuum cleaners and linoleum, wouldn't you, Amelia? Never mind. You've enough for anything. Corfield noticed the tiny pause before the final word. Enough to buy you body and soul, you poor devil, he thought. Mrs. Marinder whined on. There won't be much left at this rate, she nagged. When you are talking about this new expedition to Egypt, if you'd seen the state of the library last week, Mr. Corfield, after my husband had unwrapped a mummy hawk, the dust was inches thick. Inches! Corfield rose at this point to take his leave. He felt he could not endure that whining voice another minute. I'm afraid I must be off, Mrs. Marinder, he said. But I shall see you next Sunday, then. At lunchtime, 1 o'clock? Corfield was mistaken. He went to the gloomy house in Bloomsbury on the following Sunday, but he did not see Mrs. Marinder. The servant who opened the door looked flurried and anxious. She answered his question doubtfully. Yes, sir. I suppose that Dr. Marinder will see you. Why shouldn't he? He isn't ill, is he? Or Mrs. Marinder? No, sir. Not as I know, sir. I'll inquire, sir. As he waited, Corfield glanced from object to object in the dingy, overcrowded hall, lined with antiquities. The servant returned. Dr. Marinder will see you, sir, she said. In the library, lined with books and encased mummies, Corfield found Marinder pacing to and fro, his white face and fair hair gleaming through the foggy gloom. He burst into speech at once. Corfield, an awful thing has happened. My wife has disappeared. Since yesterday morning, about lunchtime. Your wife? Corfield stared at him in amazement. Your wife? Oh, but she must have been called away somewhere. You'll hear tomorrow, of course. There is no post today. Marinder shook his head. She wouldn't have gone like that. And she has no relations. No one likely to want her in a hurry. Something has happened, Corfield. There's been foul play. I feel it. I'm sure of it. There was agonized conviction in Marinder's face and voice. Glancing at him, an amazing thought flashed through Corfield's mind. Good God. He cared for her. You don't think that there was... He broke off impotently. No, there could be no question of a man in this case. But there were hospitals, police stations. We've searched everywhere, said Marinder helplessly. We've asked everyone, and she was so devoted to her own home. His voice broke with an emotion which was obviously genuine. I know she is dead. Marinder's prophecy was verified. Many people may remember, more or less vaguely, the sensation which was caused by Mrs. Marinder's disappearance, the theories and counter-theories, the false trails ending in blind alleys. It was not for more than 6 months that Marinder himself gave up hope, or rather, gave up the search, for his hopelessness was plain from the first. The two men were sitting together in the smoking room of the club, where Marinder had taken up his abode temporarily, shutting up the Bloomsbury house. Leaning forward, he burst out suddenly. I can't stand England. I simply can't. I must go out to Egypt and get to work. It's the only thing left now. Nothing but want of funds brought me to a standstill before. Now that obstacle doesn't exist. He broke off, sighing wearily and hopelessly. Corfield felt a sudden pang of sympathy and self-reproach. I suppose there was something in her which I couldn't see, he thought. There must have been, to make him feel like that. There's one thing I want to ask of you, Corfield, Marinder said. Will you promise that, if anything happens to me... Oh, come, Marinder. Don't be so pessimistic. It's always possible. I've appointed you executor of my will. I want to be sure that all the antiques, all the mummies and their cases, go to the British Museum. It's what Amelia wished to. You heard her say it, that they should all go to a proper museum. He smiled drearily, and Corfield gave the required promise. He saw Marinder off at Victoria a few days later, and for the following 6 months received fairly regular letters from him, reporting progress in his researches. And then Corfield received a cablegram. It informed him, curtly and baldly, that Dr. Marinder had been drowned in the Nile when bathing. It was with an odd sense of taking part in a solemn religious ceremony that Corfield admitted himself, with Marinder's latchkey, into the Bloomsbury house, one morning some little time after he had received the news. He felt rather miserable, for Marinder's death hurt more than he had reckoned with, but at the same time a vague sense of relief filled him. After all, the poor chap had looked desperately unhappy. It didn't seem as though life had been much good to him since his wife's disappearance. The big house was full of yellow, grimy fog, full of the stale smell of dust and closeness as Corfield entered the hall. From their perches the ape-faced, cat-faced deities grinned down at him more malignantly than usual. The very air seemed heavy with sinister meanings and knowledge. The museum required a definite, detailed list of the objects in question, and Corfield set to work with notebook and pencil, steadily and methodically, starting with the crowded staircase and the overcrowded entrance hall. It was not until some 3 or 4 hours later that he reached the study, where the most valuable part of the collection was kept. Here the mummies of various periods stood in their plain or ornate cases, with 1 or 2 unwrapped specimens and long glass coffins. Here were the shelves full of those costly works in a dozen languages, which dealt with the processes of mummy burial. The first ardor of Corfield's industry was by this time blunted. He was dusty, tired, thirsty, heartily sick of the job, disposed to dawdle, to waste time in a lingering examination of the specimens. He stopped before a large and elaborate mummy case, outside which was painted the face of a beautiful woman, dark-eyed, warmly colored, with hair rippled like ribbed brown sand. I wonder if the mummy inside is still like her portrait outside, he thought, or whether there's any mummy left at all. Perhaps it's crumbled away entirely. Perhaps it was never there in Marinder's time. I suppose, by the way, That's one of the things I really ought to know, to put down in this blessed list. He caught at the idea, tired of the monotonous business of inventory making. He examined the case closely and found that it could be prized open, with no particular difficulty, showing the plainer case within. Laughing at himself for idle curiosity, yet with one side of his brain obstinately persuading itself that this was a legitimate part of his duty to Marinder in the museum, Corfield lowered the long case to the ground and knelt beside it. He opened both coffers easily enough, and found within a thick layer of pungent-smelling dust. He remembered poor Mrs. Marinder's bitterness on the subject, and laughed as he scraped away the soft powder. It covered a swathed shape, showing that the mummy itself was still there. When the dust was cleared away, Corfield came upon the folds of brownish linen, tucked round and about the stiff form beneath. This removed, he saw at last the shriveled, parchment-like face, a face which held no faintest trace of the beauty to be found in the dead woman's portrait upon the outer case. And as Corfield looked at the face of the mummy, the linen which he was still holding fell from his limp clasp, and he knelt there, staring. His body was still, but his imagination moved actively. It seemed to him that there were others beside him in the library, a man and woman facing each other in anger. He heard again a nagging, querulous whine, heard complaints, abuse, reiterated vauntings of the possession of that money for which Marinder had sold himself, body and soul. He saw, in imagination, the clear pink and white of Marinder's skin turning to a dull crimson, that danger signal. After that he could visualize no details. He was aware of a locked door, of a silent house, which held only one living thing, and one which was not alive. Marinder had known all that living man could know of the methods by which mummies were made. Here, in his library and laboratory, were gathered together the appliances, the chemicals, the spices, and the face of the mummy which lay in that inner case had, upon the upper lip, a withered, fleshy wart.